Why is there such a huge gap between what we think parenting is going to be and what it actually is?
So when I heard from a lot of couples, she sets it up, she does the cognitive work, he knocks it down, he does the physical work. What I found was that usually that was a bit of an exaggeration.
Why, when we have children, do we think it's going to bring us closer together, but often it really pushes us apart?
For many of the straight couples that I interviewed, they seemed to feel like they were really stuck in patterns that weren't fully optimal from one or both of them.
What are the jobs of mums and dads now? What's a dad when we're no longer just providers? What's a mum when they often are?
We almost think of ourselves as, having two different personas, and this is more so for the men that I interviewed than for the women, right? Where it was sort of unquestioning for the men that they would go out and they would be very competent in their professional lives. Whereas in the home, the woman is historically the competent one. She is the one who's in charge and managing.
What am I supposed to teach or model for my children when I've no idea what the world is going to look like in 5 years' time?
We live in a particular world. We've all been socialized in particular ways to care about certain things. It would be really hard for a lot of women, including myself, to say, you know what, I'm just going to let my husband manage everything to do with, my daughter's medical care or something like that.
Why did my parents seem to have loads of conviction about these things and I had absolutely none? In this podcast, I talk with experts from all around the world about these problems and hopefully get some wisdom, some insight, and maybe most importantly, some perspective, and find out what it takes to be a happier parent. Allison Daminger is the professor who coined the term cognitive labor. She is a sociologist, a writer, a scholar of gender and family, and she asks, why is it so hard, even for people committed to gender equality, to find it in their own families? In her research for her amazing book, What's on Her Mind, she attempts something incredibly ambitious to measure the cognitive weight we give to various tasks as opposed to the time we spend on them. We talk about the female superhero, male bumbler archetypes that she comes across in the families she interviews. We talk about individual essentialism and the gymnastics we do to convince ourselves that it is our own personalities, not our gender, that dictate who does what at home. And we talk about if equity actually makes us happy and what we can do to find a setup that works in our couples. I hope you enjoyed the episode. You coined the term cognitive labor, right?
As far as I know, yes.
Amazing. Wow. And you start this work, right, 8 years ago. I'm going to say that the usual trajectory of women that I speak to on the podcast was, I lived my life. I knew there was inequality around. I was feminist. I was sort of navigating the world. And then I had children. And then, boom, there was this huge realization that actually the world was a very different place to the one I thought it was. But you have been working on this stuff for 8 years and you've only just had a child. Like, why were you drawn to this?
Yeah. No, that's a really good question. I think your anecdotal evidence matches what I've seen, that most people get into the parenting research once they become parents. And for me, I think part of it was I was always on the fence about whether I wanted children. And so part of this was, I wanted to understand what is parenting like, right? Sometimes, you can, if you have a research project, you have license to ask people questions about their lives. I guess if you have a podcast, you also have license to do the same thing. But, it was a really cool opportunity for me to say, okay, this is a thing that I don't actually know that much about, right? I've never been a parent. I did some babysitting, but I, had pretty little experience with kids. And I was curious about, could different gender couples divide this work equally? What was it like in 2020, 2022, et cetera, compared to, the 90s when my parents were raising me? Like, had anything changed, or were the models that I had seen passed down by my parents' generation still active? So that was the kind of personal motivation. And then, part of it too was just reading about the literature on housework inequality and having that oh, wow. Like I thought this was a thing that my grandparents dealt with, my parents dealt with. This is still here. This is still likely to be something that I'm dealing with, that my friends are going to be dealing with. So there was that intellectual curiosity of, it seems like so much has changed, and why is this piece of things still so stuck? And one of the things that I hypothesized was that it's not just the physical chores, right? That there's a lot of stuff happening in people's, and parents in particular's, heads that might be driving this kind of stuckness in the way that households run.
Okay, I've got a few things to ask about that, but let's give the listeners then a sort of definition of what cognitive labor is and how that sort of, we talk about the mental load a lot on the show, but what's cognitive labor?
Sure. So cognitive labor, I think of as the work of project management for the household. So it's about figuring out, what do family members need? What do they owe to others? And then how do we make sure that those needs get met and those obligations get fulfilled? So usually it's a 4-part process. This is sort of an idealized version of it. In practice, it can be a lot messier, but it starts with anticipating a need or a problem or an opportunity. And then it goes to, okay, what are my options? How might I address this need? Maybe I'll do some online research. Maybe I'll just talk it out with my partner. Maybe I'll do a simple brainstorm. Then it's deciding, right? Looking at your assembled options and saying, what's going to be the best path forward in this case? And then finally, and this is the piece that came relatively later in my research that I didn't quite predict, is there's monitoring and follow-up. Because once you make a decision, usually that's not the end of it. You have to, if you delegated it to someone else, you have to say, okay, did this person do it? If you're waiting for a response from some sort of service provider, a pediatrician, a teacher, a plumber, did they call you back or respond to your email or confirm that they can come at X time? And then did it actually solve the problem, right? Was the plumber able to fix the toilet, or do you need to get a new one? Is this new sleep technique you're trying actually helping your infant to sleep through the night? Or do you need to go back to the identification stage and research plan B and plan C? Right? So it's not really off your plate once you've made a decision until you know that the loop has been closed.
Yeah. And then you say in your book, which is a huge sentence to me, the brain hates unclosed loops. So then in relation to this model that you described, the anticipating, identifying, deciding, monitoring, you have this idea of the brain pinging with these problems when the loop isn't closed. And, it's interesting that you say that monitor piece came late to you, because for me, that was a huge revelation. It's like, yes, of course. And then actually as you say, when we delegate, we'll talk in a bit about how often we style it that the mums are doing the cognitive bit and we're doing the execution. But obviously when you delegate that, you don't know it's been done, and you don't know where the dad is in his process if he's pinging. So then you have to check that he's pinging. So you're still carrying it anyway.
Yeah, I give an example in the book of, a mom who wanted to get a flu shot for her kids, and she was busy. And so she said, hey, partner, can you schedule this? And then she kept checking with him every few days, like, hey, did you schedule it? Did you schedule it? And she said, it's not off my plate mentally until I know that it's taken care of. And I think that couples get into some conflict, right? Because it doesn't feel good to be checked up on for most people, right? Like if you have it handled, then you don't necessarily want your partner to be like, hey, did you do it? Did you do it? But for the person who, did the delegating, right, if they can't see what's in your head, they probably can't see what's on your to-do list or on your calendar. And so there's this bit of a disconnect that I think creates some friction for a lot of couples.
Yeah, and also sometimes when you report, like, I booked the doctor's appointment, and the mum's like, do you want a fucking medal? Like... So sometimes the reporting could be taken in the wrong spirit as well.
Yep, totally.
But I do think this knowledge, the knowledge of that is really helpful, actually. And I messaged Eloise today and was like, they're going to return those fence parts. I'm going to fix the fence. We're going to be coming back to that fence. But and she was like, okay. And I was like, no, I'm just telling you so it doesn't keep pinging you to let you know where I'm up to in this process that I am on it. So it's really valuable information. How can you measure that? You talk about measuring mind use as opposed to time use, but how?
It's really, really hard. And I think that's a big piece of why this kind of work has been so understudied and under-talked about. Because the tools that we've developed that work so well when it comes to, what actions are people taking, just do not, right? When it comes to how people are using their brains and how it's affecting them. Because I think even if we had some, magical device, some sort of, brain thing you could put on and it would capture when you were thinking about household work, I don't think converting that into time would actually give us a good sense of what weight that is carrying. Because it's not so much I spent 17 minutes this morning thinking through various issues. It's more about, I was trying to write a research paper and I kept pinging to, I need to ask the daycare teacher about this. I need to ask them. So it's the fragmentation of your attention. It's the task switching. It's the sort of, psychic weight, really. So what I tried to do, and I because this was a small interview study, I talked to just under 200 parents, so not super small, but small.
It's a lot
compared
of work.
to
For one
small,
person, don't do yourself down.
Right.
It's a
but
decent
small
sample
in
size.
the kind of compared to a survey of thousands of parents, it was incredibly labor intensive. So basically, what I did was I asked participants before the interviews to keep a log, to write down all the decisions that they were thinking about making on behalf of their family. And then I used what they wrote down to structure the first half of the interview. So Alex, you might log that, I decided to, call a company to fix the fence, or I decided that I'm going to learn to do it myself. Right. And then I'd say, tell me about, how did you notice that there was something wrong with the fence? How did this issue come to your attention? What possibilities did you think through? Did you talk to a neighbor? Did you do some online research? Right? How did the supplies get to your home? Right? And so I would kind of unpack this decision and use that as a way to understand, okay, how does home maintenance work in Alex's household? Who is keeping track of what needs fixing? We talk about the fence, but then I'd ask you, when it comes to repairs more generally, right? If something went wrong in, the plumbing or the electricity, what would your family do? And so I'd use that as a way to really get at the nitty gritty of who's managing these processes in various aspects of life. So home maintenance and car stuff and finances, but also shopping and travel planning and calendar management. And in most cases, I was able to talk to both spouses or partners independently, usually within a day or so of each other. So then I could compare their transcripts. And I could say, both Alex and his wife talked about this fence thing. But Alex spoke in a lot more detail about it, right? It seems like he really kind of has a handle on everything that's involved. He knows what's coming up. My guess is that he's really leading that process and his wife is kind of following and giving input where requested. Right. And so I would use those kinds of incidents to map out, okay, in the maintenance domain, Alex seems to be the cognitive leader. But in the shopping domain, his wife seems to be the cognitive leader. Right. And then across the different aspects of life, I would count up, okay, Alex leads in 4 domains, his wife leads in 5. They're a balanced couple, right? Because it's close to 50-50. So that's how I did it. I'm in conversation with a lot of researchers about how do we measure this at scale? Right? If we can't use time diaries and can't use time, then what do we do? And, I can go down a whole rabbit hole about the different possibilities there, but I don't know that anyone has really cracked it. I think the best that I've seen is pretty detailed survey questions about, particular cognitive tasks, right? We'd ask about, the last time a home repair happened, who handled it? those kinds of things. And that's probably the closest we can get. But I'm actually organizing an academic conference this summer where we're going to sit down and try and hash some of this out and see if, can anyone figure this out in a more
It's fascinating because you're talking
way.
about a sort of a really unique part of consciousness, which is our ability to think about what we're thinking about, right? So do you meditate?
Not as much as I like, but
you
I'm trying to get back into
you
it.
try it, right? So
Yeah.
I think it's just really interesting to think about that as an attempted baseline, right? Where let's say you're trying to focus just on your breath, and then what usually happens is you realize you've been thinking about something else for a time. It's not that you do start thinking about it, but you only clock that you started thinking about it when it's been going on for a bit. And then sometimes you can track your thoughts back to where that thought come, and sometimes you can't. So it led me, because I've been trying to do it since I started reading your book, and it's like, right, we don't make decisions about what we think about. They sort of attack us. They come in unbidden, and exactly as you said, often as we're only aware of it when we're trying to do something else and the onions start burning, or I'm like, if I'm really in my head, I realize I've sung the same song twice in front of like the kids that I work with, and I'm like, no one cares because it's all mums there doing their own cognitive labor and no one's actually paying any attention. But yeah, I found that really interesting, and I think within that is a clue to why this is such a big deal, because actually it represents disruption, right? And it's like getting constantly pinged with emails. And you draw that analogy that, right, and anyone who was teaching you to be productive would tell you to not have your emails pinging up on your screen, right?
Turn off your phone, put it on silent, better yet, put it in the next room. But you can't do that when you have the sort of metaphorical smartphone pinging in your brain at all times. The brain does not have a do not disturb setting, unfortunately.
Yes. So then a big takeaway from your research is personal essentialism. Explain what essentialism is, just in case people don't understand.
Yeah, so essentialism in the classic sense is when you assign sort of characteristics to a group. You say, okay, men are from Mars, women are from Venus, or wherever they're from, right? Men are tough, men are assertive, women are, submissive, women are nurturing, right? You say, because you are a member of this group, right? Whether it's, class or gender or race or something else, you have this essential innate characteristic. And historically, right, we can, I'm sure you can think of a lot of, essentialist ideas about how men and women are intrinsically different, right? I mentioned a few of them. Men like things, they like building, they like, problem solving, they're okay with conflict. Women like people, right? They're caring and they want to bring people together. And what I try to argue in the book is that, not for everybody, but for a lot of the folks that I interviewed, college educated parents, middle and upper middle class, those gender essentialist ideas have fallen out of favor, right? This sense that, okay, you manage the house because that's your job. You're a woman and that's what women do. That was not something that most of the people that I interviewed would feel comfortable saying. But they still fell into those gendered patterns. And so what I found was that they brought in personality. And they said, no, it's not a gender thing. It's a me thing, right? That's what my favorite quote from one of my respondents. She said, I don't, do all this cognitive labor because I'm a woman and that's what women do. I do all this cognitive labor because I personally am really organized and uptight. I'm kind of a control freak. And so, my husband, he's pretty laid back. He's kind of disorganized. So of course he doesn't do it, right? And that makes sense at the level of the individual couple. But I kept hearing that over and over and over again. And I went to the psychology data.
From both partners.
Yes.
I think that's, it's not just the women saying it's the men
exactly.
saying as well, she's like this and I'm like this. You're seeing the same pattern of personality types again and again and again.
Yeah. And I said, did I accidentally recruit a cluster of type A women? Like what's going on here? So I looked at the data on gender and personality differences at the population level. And there are some minor differences, right? On the whole, women are a little higher in some of the big five personality traits than men are and vice versa. But the differences are quite small, right? Not the huge gulf that my respondents were telling me about. So what I came to see was that, I think that this idea that it's personality is sort of helping people make sense of why have we fallen into these roles that we didn't plan to fall into, right? We didn't want to replicate what our parents did, yet we find ourselves here. It must be something other than gender driving it. And, personality was the explanation that many of them turned to.
This gets them around some tricky cognitive dissonance, as you say, of like, we're these type of people, but we're doing this thing which doesn't match those values. It's because of our individual personality types.
Yeah, it's quite uncomfortable when you are confronted with, I thought I was in an equal relationship. I thought I was a feminist. I thought I was this. And as I'm telling you about the way that I arrange my life with my partner, I'm realizing that it seems a little different than what I thought of myself or I thought of my relationship as being. And so that's a really uncomfortable place to sit. And so what most people do in a lot of different contexts, not just household labor, is try to reframe things to remove that conflict. And so I think that's what this personality explanation was doing for them.
And you identify these two types as the superhero, superwoman, and the bumbler.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess what struck me, and you said there at the beginning when you were talking about essentialism, that actually, we think that men are kind of tough and assertive, and it's an older stereotype, right? But that women are submissive, and I'm thinking of Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, where Indy is kind of like doing everything and he's the problem solver, and he's dragging this sort of semi-useless, glitzy blonde woman around with him and sort of saving her as they move around. And I just wonder if that older stereotype of men and women helps us believe that the superhero bumbler is an opposite to that stereotype. So that helps us believe that it's our personal spouse who's different from other women. Do you see what I mean?
Interesting. I was going to go in a slightly different direction.
There's something slightly aspirational for both in the superhero and the bumbler. Like, the bumbler, do you have Peppa Pig in America?
I know of it, yeah.
Right. So Daddy Pig is a silly pig, right? And he's always getting things wrong and he's incompetent, but it's soft, and this kind of laissez-fairness, it's in contrast to this kind of boundaried dad who is authoritative that we all kind of grew up with. And likewise, there's something in this hyper-competent planner woman which rejects that old idea of women as passive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting observation. So part of it, right, is if we go back to this idea of the separate spheres, right? This idea that there's the domestic and then there's the sort of market world, right? And during the Industrial Revolution, this big switch happened for families where they had been, mom and dad both worked on the homestead, right? And maybe they were doing different jobs, but they were both productive in terms of, producing food for their families and caring for their livestock. And then when the Industrial Revolution happens, we have this sense that there are two different worlds. There's the world of the domestic that is supposed to be a haven from the cold, ruthless marketplace. And then there's the world of the market, right? Where commerce happens, where productivity happens, where, men go out and solve problems. So the way that I typically think of this is we almost think of ourselves as, having two different personas, and this is more so for the men that I interviewed than for the women, right? Where it was sort of unquestioning for the men that they would go out and they would be very competent in their professional lives.
Very
right?
unbumbly.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And that sort of space of professional competence and breadwinning, right, is tied up to a lot of our masculine ideals. Whereas in the home, the woman is historically the competent one. She is the one who's in charge and managing, right? And so I think you're right to point out this sort of, duality between these stereotypes and contradictions. And I think that it's sort of like what context. So Indiana Jones, he's out, he's solving problems. We can think of that as his professional job, We don't really see him, in his home life. We don't know if he is, managing the laundry or like tackling the cooking. My guess is the hapless blonde would probably be more of the sort of superhuman at home. Could be an interesting spinoff.
When you talked in the book about, this change in the 1800s from there being just one space, you talked about the workplace is kind of rational and market driven, and the home is morality driven and virtue driven. And that's such a big piece of the puzzle, isn't it? I think, as to why this happens. The judgment on women when they don't do this work is there's a moral judgment as well as a functional piece about this is how a home works. It's like you're bad if it's not like this.
Yeah. No, I think that's absolutely right. Is in the sociology of gender, we talk a lot about accountability. Right. And if you are doing your gender, performing your gender correctly, right, no one will bat an eye. They'll be like, oh, yeah, she's a woman, she's doing X. But when you do something that violates people's assumptions about what a mom should do or what a dad should do, right, then they'll give you a second look. You might, get a raised eyebrow, maybe a snarky comment. And even if that doesn't come, right, it is something that many of us have internalized. So I am, if I'm out with my husband and my daughter and, she's not dressed in the right clothes for the weather, I assume that everyone is judging me as a bad mom, right? Oh no, she forgot her hat on this cold day. What kind of mom does that? I've compared notes with my husband and he has no such worries, right? He has a lot of worries about other things, including, is he earning enough for the family? Is he seen as a responsible, father and providing, right? So it's not that women are held accountable for everything and men are held accountable for nothing. It's that I think that consciously or not, we are making pretty rational assessments of, okay, I am likely to, get the call from daycare if my daughter forgets something. If we forget to bring, an extra change of clothes or an extra whatever, I'm more likely to get the call. So let me be hyper organized. Let me make sure that doesn't happen, that I don't have to deal with the consequences, that I don't have to deal with the judgment, right? And my husband has a whole different set of pressures that come with being a father. And I really try hard in the book and when I talk about the research to say, this is not just a matter of personal intention, right? This is a whole set of social and cultural forces that makes this the path of least resistance for heterosexual couples, right? You can have the best of intentions, as I think many of the folks that I interviewed did, right? And there are a lot of reasons that it's quite hard to carry those out.
So yeah, there's a second point you're pointing to there, right? Which is getting the call from the daycare. That women experience the judgment around, is this child dressed properly? But also, even if it wasn't from daycare, once these patterns are established, they also feel the pain of it not being done right. So if one person is in charge of food and children's food, and this used to be the case for us, this used to happen, that I'd be playing with the kids and all of a sudden they would stop and basically run and find their mum and be like, we're starving. And I'd be like, why would no one say, they were fine. She was like, I can't believe you didn't feed them. But they don't ask me for food. She just feels the pain from me having forgotten to do it. So then she's really on me with a schedule of feeding them that's sort of curtailing the activities and stuff that I want to do with them. But, I couldn't see it at the time. I just felt, I guess, disempowered, just constantly being told what to do about these kind of sort of slightly invisible things. And I couldn't see that it's just that when they weren't getting done, the pain was always falling on her rather than me.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right to point out that it's, well, I'm sure there's, many more than two things, but it's anticipation of judgment, right? If this gets done poorly, who's going to be judging me? And it's anticipation of consequences. The kids are going to come running to me screaming if they're hungry, right? Because they see me as, needing food or as the one who provides, good snacks. And I think a piece of this too is kids have preferences and kids learn patterns. And so sometimes, when couples try to make adjustments, it's the kids who are like, no, mom does this. Mom is the one that I want to provide, a special snack. You don't, cut the apple in the right way or whatever the case may be. So add that to the mix of challenges. Once a pattern is established, other people learn who does what and can't necessarily switch on a dime.
Yes. And then that, I've been thinking, I've been thinking about my fence, it also makes it that when the expectation is gendered, it makes it tricky to switch. I think one of the reasons we've found it easier than some couples do to identify the fact that so much of what we do is gendered is that basically I hate the masculine coded stuff. There is like nothing in me that is any good at any DIY, that has any inclination to sort of understand drains or the boiler or anything like that. So it's just the expectation that I'll be the one that would do it means that I do. And then obviously I'm now the one who has the guy's number and has a sort of basic understanding of the way our home plumbing system works. Even though I hate it and I've got I'm just no good at it. So that's it does happen to men. It's just those expectations are there's just so many more of them on women than there are on us once you have kids, I would say.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I have, a number of stories in the book about men who would tell me, my wife can't touch the lawn. Like she does it poorly. I really don't, I'm in charge there. And women who are like, a lawnmower, what's that? Right. And so it's not just a thing that men do. It's like what tasks are coded masculine. And so men are sort of expected to know how to do it. What tasks are, they worried their neighbors are going to judge them for letting the lawn grow too long. And I think the other thing that your story points to is that initially, perhaps when you started your marriage or bought your first home, perhaps you and your wife had a similar amount of DIY know-how. But over time, it sounds
both on zero. Yeah.
Okay. Both on zero. Right. And I talk in the book about, it's when people talk about this as personality and instinct, what they're forgetting is that, this is a skill building process. And it sounds like you, Alex, have invested over the years, somewhat reluctantly perhaps, in learning how to do some of the basic repairs, in building up a sort of, Rolodex of, okay, here's the guy I call for this, here's the guy I call for that, right? And so in this moment, probably you are better at this sort of thing. That doesn't mean that, this is a personality difference between you and your wife or an intrinsic thing that you could never change, right? But it's a sort of, small gap that becomes a chasm over time when one person invests and the other sort of lets those skills atrophy.
And become a story about self. I think, the example you give in the book is about you with directions. And Allison has no sense of direction. You've been told this since you're a child. It's a family joke, whereas your partner loves geography. He becomes the navigator. But then you point out that obviously, you've traveled extensively to places where there was no app that could get you around. And you did learn it, but you had to be in an environment where your story wasn't appropriate to you getting out of it.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's really valuable. And, this this point about the narratives and stories of self makes me think of some other research on siblings, right? And part of the way that sibling dynamics operate, right? Often we're seen as so different. The older sibling is like really, on top of it and whatever, and the younger sibling is this. It's partly this caricature, right? The family story is that, eldest daughter is like this, youngest son is like that. And I think that's a similar, like we as families tell stories and tell narratives about the role each person plays. And there's a grain of truth to it. Like I do not have a great sense of direction, but, my capacity is a lot greater than the family jokes would suggest.
Yeah. And also that's making me think about, our fixed sense of self, which in some ways is, it's reassuring to have a story and really firm edges to who you are. But actually what matrescence and patrescence do is they open the door to us kind of shifting and becoming something different. And I think in some ways that's forced on women, like through the process of becoming pregnant and giving birth, but it's totally available to men, that we don't have to stick to these decisions that we've made about who we are.
Yeah, and that's one of the messages of the book that I would like to think is hopeful. I'm that these things for many of the straight couples that I interviewed, they seem to feel like they were really stuck in patterns that weren't fully optimal from one or both of them. Right? They would say like, well, if I asked all of them, if I had a magic wand, and I could give you your ideal when it comes to how you divide up this cognitive work, would you keep things as they are? Would you change them? And most people said, well, this is not my ideal, right? But they felt like they were pretty much stuck. And so I think that this message that, no, this is not just intrinsic to your personality. This is a set of skills that you can make choices about investing in or not, right? That message, I think, is hopeful, right? That change is possible. As someone who is, in early parenthood, I think one of the challenges is you're exhausted, and it's hard to change when you're exhausted. So I remember the first few months after my daughter was born, my husband and I fell into certain patterns, as all couples do, and he was like, "Wait a minute, are we okay with this? Is this how we want things to be?" I was like, "I'm too tired. I can't think beyond tomorrow. Let's just do whatever is easiest in this moment." And so I'm sympathetic to the fact that growth and change and learning new skills, that takes a certain amount of bandwidth that many parents are quite low on, particularly in those early days. But that's when the patterns get established and become so hard to change later. So it's a bit of a bear.
Yes, but you can. But yeah, that's really making me think of my mate who's in a same-sex couple. I mean, you spend quite a lot of time on same-sex relationships in the book, but he was saying, look, this sounds terrible, but actually sometimes I'm like, it would be nice to have a gender default rather than absolutely everything be up for grabs and need discussion. Like no one assumes they're doing anything. And yeah, I just thought it was really funny. It was like we both thought Father's Day was going to be brilliant.
Right. Oh,
obviously,
man.
no one took the lead on that one.
Yeah.
Just talk to me then about, you were talking then about couples who were stuck, but actually the correlation between these various situations, you have some who are sharers, some who are man-led or woman-led. You're talking about the family being man-led or woman-led there. Is there a happy formula?
This is one of the things that I think the headline of just share equitably and everyone will be happy. I think that's misleading, right? So I have a chapter in the book about these couples who do things differently. Either they share the cognitive labor pretty equally or they put more on his plate. And some of those couples seemed quite happy. Some of them seemed very unhappy. And so I think that part of it is the level of intentionality. So the sort of non-traditional couples, right, the man-led or balanced couples, some of them, it seemed like that was the ethos of their partnership from if not the beginning, from early on. They had sort of oriented around this sense that, we're going to value both of our careers equally, or we're going to give priority to her career. We both feel really passionate about being super involved in our kids' lives. And they made, decisions and choices, and that's how they thought of themselves from the start. Those couples, it wasn't all sunshine and roses. I talk about how they sometimes faced societal pushback and reminders that, hey, you're doing something differently. But for the most part, they seemed like, this is challenging, but it's worth it, and we feel good about this. There was another set of those non-traditional couples, though, where they sort of fell into equality or sort of a man-led arrangement. Usually that happened in cases where her career took off and his stagnated, or some other sort of circumstance made it so that, okay, it really makes a lot of sense for us to put more of this mental work on him. And some of those couples, that turned out okay. This wasn't what they expected, but they made the best of it. But for other couples in that boat, and particularly the men in those couples, I sense that they really felt this disconnect between what they had imagined for their lives and what they were experiencing. And they felt this friction between, their image of themselves as the provider and, this traditional, head of household, and the way that their life had actually turned out. And that didn't necessarily sit well. And I think it goes back to some of what we were talking about earlier in terms of judgment and accountability, right? And our story of ourselves. All of these pieces, if you have this story of yourself as, okay, I'm going to fill this particular role in my family. If you have this, your in-laws are like, why don't you earn as much money, right? Those are points of friction that I think, sure, you can divide the work 50-50. That doesn't necessarily get you out of all of those other factors that shape how we feel about our division of labor.
Just wondering if you think, we don't give a lot of status to caregiving. Do you think we give men even less status for caregiving than we do to women? Like if men are in that role, do they get less status from it than a woman who was kind of smashing it in that field?
That's a really interesting question. And so there's some contradictory, patterns here. So number one, I think that because the, bar for father involvement tends to be lower. I hear from a lot of men who are like, I took my kid to the playground and I got pats on the back from all the other.
It's a stream of high fives.
Exactly.
Go, you legend, go.
Yeah. So that's there on the one hand, but on the other, I think that there is, a strong sense that if you are not providing for your family, right? If you are, not super ambitious from a career perspective, but more ambitious from a home perspective, right? Like that is not as legible for men than it is for women. I think like the stay-at-home dad maybe gets some kudos, right? He's out there on the playground. He's visible as a father, and people think that's cool. But that's probably also coupled with this sense of, oh, like that guy doesn't want to work. Like what's up with that? And so I don't know that it's a global men get less status or not, but
That's
I do
really
think
complicated,
it's sort of against the grain in ways that are sometimes viewed as positive and sometimes viewed as negative, depending on the context.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I had a mate who works. He's a filmmaker, and sometimes he's working really, really hard, and sometimes he's not. But he's sort of like, I wish I did have like a Rolex or a fat car or some kind of status symbol, so that when I'm getting to all this time with my kid, people know that it's not just because I'm unemployed.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Then I could have the best of both worlds.
Yeah,
where
that's
I
so
look
interesting.
like this provider, but I'm still getting the time. Whereas at the moment, I'm doing it, but I'm not quite enjoying it because I'm worried I'm being looked down on.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think the bit that I've not asked you about, which is really important to the whole story, is this general idea of she sets them up, I knock them down. I think that's a a quote where basically, yeah, she's all over the thinking and the planning, usually because that's just the way she is. And then I do the execution. What's the problem with people's perception there? What are they missing?
So what I saw in my data, right, is that I call this, an offsetting pattern, right? Where if we think of, okay, there's the physical work of, cooking meals and scrubbing floors and, tucking children into bed, then there's the cognitive work. And there are these two different dimensions of household life. So when I heard from a lot of couples, she sets it up, she does the cognitive work, he knocks it down, he does the physical work. What I found was that usually that was a bit of an exaggeration, right? Usually she was doing the majority of both cognitive and physical work, but the gap between partners tended to be smaller for physical work, right? So she was sort of, just to put arbitrary figures on it, maybe she's doing 80% of the cognitive management for the household, but only 60% of the physical management for the household, right? So they were, I think, pointing to something real that, we're not as unequal when it comes to the doing of chores. I'm super involved as a dad. It wasn't quite an offset for most couples. There were a few where it did seem like, okay, she's doing all the planning, he's doing most of the doing. But more often, right, it was a smaller gap, but still female-led in both of those areas of household work.
And I think, to go back to your sort of initial point about why you got interested in this, which is basically, it's not changing. Why isn't it changing? I went to see Lucy Jones speak last week, and it's a similar thing. She quotes someone in her book from the 70s who's quoting someone from the 50s, and it's like, this is all depressingly could be now. And I think ultimately the thing that hasn't shifted is that we all still feel, men and women, that children are ultimately the responsibility of the mother. I think that is the big picture thing that hasn't shifted. And, you in your conclusion, you talk about things that governments can do and things that organizations can do. But what can we do about that in our couples? I mean, I don't know if you agree that that's the root of this problem, actually, but
I think there are many roots, but I agree that is, one of the big ones, right? That we don't necessarily expect women to do everything for their kids, but we expect them to care the most, to be the ones who are ultimately accountable, the ones who know their children best, right? That
you said
is something.
The range of acceptable activities for men and women appears to be expanding faster than the range of acceptable selves. So good.
Yeah. Thanks. I think we've told, I think we've done, this is a whole nother podcast, but I think we've done a much better job of telling women you can be and do all these different things than we've done with men, right? I think men's options are still a lot more limited, but that hasn't changed our underlying sense of what we expect women to care about, what we expect them, to be good at when it comes to the household and particularly their children. I thought it was really telling. So we talked a minute ago about those non-traditional couples where it's balanced or he does more. In, I think, all but maybe one case, she was still the leader when it came to, managing the kids' external activities and school and pediatrician and, camps and things like that, right? That was the sort of, my moms would say to me, like, I don't care how clean my house is. I don't care, what the lawn looks like, right? But I just care that my kids are okay and that I'm okay, right? And so I think that piece is really, exactly as you say, a big sticking point.
So then what do we do? Like in an individual setting, because look, let's just do me. I am so much better than I was because I've been working on it. I can see and acknowledge and be grateful for a lot of the invisible stuff. Weirdly, because I guess because of personal skills and because of my, what I do for my other job, I'm the one who's in charge of anything related to school and kids' activities and all that stuff. Although my wife did the research for the schools, it's really important not to claim stuff that wasn't mine. Women, like it's just the research piece is fascinating just on its own, isn't it? Because I'm on all the mums groups and I'm on some dads groups, and the majority, of literal pings that go off are research. Mums doing research, whether that be about prams or schools or ailments or a rash or anything. It's just mums working on this stuff all the time. So I can just, I see that. I can physically see that happening on my phone, which is really interesting. So where was I? I was saying that we can see the invisible. We're a lot more appreciative because of the judgment piece and because of the set patterns, which mean my wife is sort of pays more than I do when things go wrong from the kids' point of view. She's the complaints department. We're nowhere near 50-50. Like, what can we do in these sort of, what can I do? What can she do in these circumstances to move things to closer to equity?
First, I would say, others might, feel differently. I don't necessarily think that you have to be 50-50, right? I think that what matters most is that you are living out your values and your personal, preferences, goals, etc. So if both of you were to sit down and say, well, we're more like 60-40, but we're okay with it, then I would say, great, don't fix it if it isn't broken. The issue is that for a lot of couples, at least one partner, usually a woman in a heterosexual couple, feels overburdened, right? And so let's say that is your situation where, your wife is like, I would like to have a little less on my plate. So if you establish that there's a mismatch between your values as individuals in a couple and what you're doing, then I think you have to be really strategic. So my advice to a lot of couples is to think practically, right? We live in a particular world. We've all been socialized in particular ways to care about certain things. It would be really hard for a lot of women, including myself, to say, you know what, I'm just going to let my husband manage everything to do with, my daughter's medical care or something like that, right? And so maybe that's not the thing that we start with. We start with the thing that I don't really care as much about, cooking meals. That is something that I'm not really worried about being judged by others. It's not something where, there are likely to be huge consequences that are going to fall disproportionately on me. That's a good area, right? Where I don't feel super strongly about how this happens. There aren't a lot of others around on a daily basis to judge us. So let's start there. What would it mean? What do we agree on as kind of, here's what we're going for from a meals perspective? And then how do we hand it over top to bottom to my spouse, right? How do we not just say, okay, you're going to cook meals, but you're going to make the grocery list and you're going to troubleshoot if we're out of the thing you need.
And you're going to plan the meals. You're going to plan the meals. It's just the really annoying part.
Exactly. So that's, I think being strategic, like I think that, I'm not going to tell a couple that if they want to just challenge gender norms for the sake of challenging gender norms, that they can't do that. But what I think is a little bit more realistic for most couples is to say, you know what, we're products of our society. There are a lot of forces that have led us to this particular division. Why don't we adjust on the margins, right? Things that, sometimes they're gendered, right? You do the DIY stuff. Maybe it's not, your super strong preference, right? But you don't necessarily have to flip roles just because, you want to challenge gender conventions. I think that there's value for a lot of couples in acknowledging the obstacles and then just identifying what are the tasks each of you are doing that you really don't want to be doing. You're not deriving a lot of individual benefit from. Right? If, you're passionate about cooking, then maybe that's a bad example. Maybe you don't derive a lot of benefit from shopping for holiday gifts for people. So is that something you can hand over? So I think it's really, there's not a one size fits all when it comes to the end allocation or the exact path. I think it's really about not just defaulting.
It's
You mentioned
really
earlier
interesting because
oh, go
you're
ahead.
saying like, basically, you can challenge, actually it's really powerful to be able to challenge this personal essentialism narrative and be like, I'm not doing this because this is me. Actually, there's a lot of gendered pressure on me to do this, and not just pressure. I'm like, let's say I get Eloise to put up this fence and she goes round to my neighbor for help and he's going to be like, what? Why isn't Alex putting up the fence? I'll just put up the fence for you.
I mean, that might not be a bad outcome.
But I can't do that because that will make me a bad man. So it's like, appreciate that all that's going on. You can call it out and be like, we don't have to attack this for the sake of it. This is, sometimes you are going to kind of do those things, but it's still got intentionality behind it because you've talked about it, right?
Yeah, and that's, I think, when you were talking about your friend who's in a same-sex male couple, right, where they don't take things for granted. There's no default. And that has pros and cons, right? It can be exhausting, as your friend was saying, to have to decide all of these things. But queer couples are a lot less likely, and I saw this in my research, to fall into patterns that are suboptimal for both of them, right? Because they didn't talk about it. That's not usually the problem that they face. And so I think that's something that, straight couples can learn from is society is going to give you a set of defaults, right, based on your gender. And the path of least resistance is often just to fall into those defaults. But if you feel like some of those don't actually fit what you want for your life, then you have a conversation, and it does take energy to make these shifts. It sometimes you get social pushback. Sometimes there's a rocky transition period. So I think it's probably unrealistic for most couples to say, let's just, ignore all societal conventions and, norms, and we're gonna start from scratch. Like, no, make changes on the margins. What are the pain points? What are the things that Eloise does but really, really hates? It's part of the woman's role, quote unquote, but she does not get any value from it. She doesn't care about it being done this way. She's just doing it because that's what women do. Those are the places that I think you can get the most bang for your buck. And you are likely to sort of have the interest and energy that it takes to change some of these patterns.
Yeah, I really like that. I just an interesting point that I've said this before on the podcast, that I think it was really interesting for me to talk to Eloise and be like, when I mess up on one of the things that I'm supposed to be doing with the school or the doctor's appointment, even though we've established it's my job, do you still feel guilty? And she was like, yeah, because I think it's gone wrong because I should have been doing it. And I just think that's a real testament to how powerful this gender thing is. We've sort of got to acknowledge that it's still there.
Yeah, and that's a hard feeling. People have asked me, if I've changed my mind on anything in this research since becoming a parent myself. And my answer is usually, I haven't changed my mind, but I think that this emotional piece, right, of guilt and shame and, those pieces, I think I might have emphasized a bit more if I were writing it today, because they're just so visceral. Right. And I think they drive a lot of these patterns that we've been discussing.
I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. Allison's book is What's on Her Mind: The Mental Workload of Family Life. Check out her website, AllisonDaminger.com. Please subscribe to the podcast and follow me on Instagram and TikTok at Be a Happier Parent, and I'll see you all next week.